My parents kicked me out over Grandpa's vinyl records. I never imagined it would change my life forever. I never thought vinyl records would change my life. But then again, I never thought I'd be kicked out of my own house at 17 either. Life's funny that way. My name's Jason, and I've always been the outsider in my suburban Portland family. While everyone around me was obsessed with TikTok dances and whatever trendy music Spotify's algorithms were pushing that week, I was the weird kid wearing faded Led Zeppelin t-shirts and trying to explain to my classmates why Stairway to Heaven was the greatest song ever written. They just didn't get it. My parents weren't any better. Dad was your typical real estate agent, obsessed with curb appeal and what the neighbors might think. Mom had somehow turned baking into an Instagram career, with thousands of followers drooling over her perfect kitchen and even more perfect cupcakes. And then there was my brother Alex, the high school quarterback turned wannabe fitness influencer, who spent more time flexing in the mirror than actually talking to me. But Grandpa Charlie, he got me. His garage was my sanctuary, this incredible time capsule filled with thousands of vinyl records stacked floor to ceiling. The first time he played The Dark Side of the Moon for me when I was 12, something clicked. The way the music filled the room was different than anything I'd experienced through earbuds or speakers. It was alive. Music is the soul of its time, Jason, he'd say, carefully placing the needle on an Abbey Road record. These songs aren't just sounds, they're history you can touch. Those afternoons in his garage were the only times I felt like I belonged somewhere. We'd spend hours flipping through his collection while he told stories about seeing Hendrix set a guitar on fire at Monterey, or how he once stood in line for 20 hours to get tickets to the Doors. Then, 3 weeks ago, Grandpa Charlie had a heart attack in his sleep. The funeral was small, just family and a few old friends. I wore the Black Sabbath t-shirt he'd given me for my last birthday. Mom complained it wasn't appropriate, but I knew Grandpa would have approved. I thought that was the worst day of my life. I was wrong. The real bomb dropped during the reading of the will. Most of Grandpa's modest savings went to my parents, his car to Alex, and the house would be sold. But to me, he left his entire record collection, over 3,000 vinyl albums collected across 50 years of his life. While everyone else looked disappointed by their inheritance, I couldn't believe my luck. That collection was priceless, not just in monetary value, though some of those first pressings were worth serious cash, but because each record carried a piece of Grandpa's soul. My parents, however, saw it differently. Where exactly do you plan to put all this junk? Dad asked that night at dinner, stabbing his fork into his salmon, like it had personally offended him. It's not junk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Some of these albums are incredibly rare. The original pressing of the Velvet Underground's first album alone is worth what? Taking up space in our garage. Mom cut in, barely looking up from her phone, where she was arranging her dinner for the perfect Instagram shot. That's not going to happen. I'm turning that space into my baking studio next month. Alex snorted. Your brain is like those records, Jason, stuck in the 70s. Maybe you could sell them at a flea market for $5 or something. I felt my face getting hot. This collection meant everything to Grandpa. He spent his whole life. And now it's over, Dad interrupted, his voice carrying that tone that meant the discussion was finished. He's gone, Jason. And in this house, we don't have room for clutter. You need to choose, either get rid of the records or find somewhere else to keep them. I looked around the table, hoping someone would back me up, but Mom was still perfecting her food photo, and Alex was already flexing for his post-workout selfie. These records are a legacy. I tried again. Grandpa wanted me to have them because he knew I'd appreciate them. They're not clutter, they're history. Alex laughed and reached across the table, grabbing the Pink Floyd record I brought in to show them. Before I could stop him, he snapped it in half. Here's your Dark Side of the Moon, he sneered, dropping the broken pieces onto my plate. Something inside me broke along with that vinyl. I stared at the black shards mixing with my dinner, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Dad shook his head. Jason, we live in the real world, not in your rock and roll fantasies. Either you're with this family, or you need to pack your bags. In that moment, I understood they weren't just throwing away Grandpa's records. They were throwing away me. Later that night, while stuffing clothes into my backpack, I remembered something Grandpa told me once. Life is like a record, kid. The important thing is to make sure the needle doesn't get stuck. Well, my needle was definitely stuck, but maybe it was time to play a different tune somewhere else. I called Mike, my one friend who didn't think I was a total weirdo for preferring cream over whatever was topping the charts. Mike's parents had a finished basement they rarely used, and they were cool, the kind of adults who actually listened when teenagers talked. Come over, he said without hesitation. We can store the records in our basement. My dad actually has a turntable gathering dust somewhere. That night, under cover of darkness, we loaded 3,000 pieces of musical history into Mike's rusty van. The records barely fit, and we had to make 2 trips to get everything. The whole time, I kept waiting for someone in my house to notice what was happening, to come out and stop me. No one did. As Mike's van pulled away from my house for the final time, I looked back at the perfect suburban home with its perfect lawn and perfect emptiness. I thought about walking back in, apologizing, agreeing to forget about the records and Grandpa's legacy just to keep the peace. Instead, I pulled out the one record I had kept separate from the others, a worn copy of the Doors' first album. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice. Morrison knew something the rest of them didn't. Sometimes you have to break on through to the other side. I climbed into the passenger seat of Mike's van, clutching that record to my chest like a shield. As we turned the corner, and my house disappeared from view, I made a promise to myself and to Grandpa's memory. I would prove him right. Music isn't just sound. It's history, it's connection, it's life. And sometimes, it's the only thing that can save you. Mike's basement was something straight out of a budget horror movie. Damp concrete walls, flickering fluorescent lights that buzz like angry hornets, and a persistent musty smell that no amount of air freshener could mask. But to me, it was the Ritz-Carlton of vinyl sanctuaries. Welcome to the 5-star vinyl hotel. Mike announced as we carried, in the last boxes, can't promise sushi service, but I've got some leftover pizza and warm beer in a mini fridge upstairs. His parents were surprisingly cool about the whole situation. When I explained what happened, Mike's mom just shook her head and said something about my parents needing therapy. His dad helped to set up some shelving units he had in storage, perfect for organizing the records. For the first week, I slept on an air mattress that slowly deflated throughout the night, leaving me practically on the floor by morning. But I didn't care. Every morning, I'd wake up surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with musical history, and I'd feel like the richest teenager in Portland. At least I wasn't completely broke. Mike had hooked me up with a part-time gig at Vintage Vinyl, where he worked. The pay wasn't great, but employee discount on equipment and cleaning supplies were clutch for the restoration project. Plus, working surrounded by music all day, not exactly a hardship. The store owner, Dave, was this old-school rocker who'd seen Nirvana live and had endless stories about the golden age of music. He took one look at my Doors t-shirt on the first day and decided I was worth keeping around. The cataloging process was like listening to Stairway to Heaven on repeat. Beautiful but exhausting. Each record needed to be inspected, cleaned, and properly stored in new protective sleeves. Mike helped when he could, but between school and our shifts at the shop, progress was slow. Most evenings, I'd work alone, carefully removing each vinyl from its sleeve, checking for scratches under the basement's harsh lighting, and adding it to the growing spreadsheet on my laptop. Some nights, I'd get lost listening to albums I'd never heard before, discovering music that had been popular decades before I was born. I found myself wondering what Grandpa Charlie had been doing when he first heard these songs. Was he driving down some highway with the windows down when Born to Run first played on the radio? Was he dancing with Grandma to My Girl at some college party? 2 weeks in, I hit a gold mine. There I was, working through another box of records, nothing particularly exciting. Mostly 80s pop, that wasn't really my thing. I pulled out what looked like a Beatles album. Nothing special at first glance. But when I slid the record out, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, an original receipt from 1964. Curious, I examined the album more carefully. Unbelievable. What I was holding wasn't just any Beatles album. It was a promotional copy of Meet the Beatles, with something scrawled across the front cover. Something that looked suspiciously like signatures. For signatures. My hand started shaking so bad I had to put the record down before I damaged it. "Mike!" I yelled upstairs, my voice cracking like I was 13 again. "Mike, get down here." He thundered down the stairs, probably thinking I found a rat or something equally horrible. "What's wrong? You sound like you're being murdered down here." He stopped when he saw my face. I whispered, pointed to the album on the table, "I think that's signed by all four Beatles." Mike leaned in, squinting at the signatures. "Dude, if that's real, it's worth more than my car and this entire basement combined." We spent the next few hours researching Beatles autographs online, comparing the signatures to authenticated ones. The more we looked, the more convinced we became. These weren't just similar. They were exact matches to known authentic signatures from early 1964, when the band first came to America. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Grandpa never mentioned owning something this valuable. Had he forgotten? Or had he known exactly what he was doing when he left me his collection? The next day, we took the album to work with us at Vintage Vinyl. Dave, the owner, had become something of a mentor to me over the past couple weeks. The gray-haired man, who looked like he'd been to every major concert since Woodstock, put on white gloves before handling the record. After examining it under a special light and comparing the signatures to a reference book, he looked up at me with wide eyes. "Kid, do you have any idea what you're holding?" I nodded. "A signed Beatles album?" "Not just any signed album. This is a promotional copy sent to radio stations before their first U.S. tour. And these signatures? They're from when the band made an appearance at Wynn's Radio in New York. There are maybe 5 of these in existence." He handed the record back to me like it was made of glass. "If you're looking to sell, I'd recommend a major auction house. This could easily go for 6 figures. Mike looked like he was about to pass out. I wasn't feeling much steadier myself. On the bus ride home, clutching the album in its new protective case, Mike kept mumbling about all the things we could buy with that kind of money. A car, a house, a lifetime supply of pizza. But I wasn't thinking about buying anything. I was thinking about Grandpa Charlie, wondering if he knew what he'd given me. Not just the money, though that was life-changing, but the proof that sometimes the things others dismiss as worthless junk can be priceless treasures. After consulting with Mike's parents, who knew a lawyer, I decided to list the album with a prestigious music memorabilia auction house in New York. They authenticated it again and estimated its value between $150,000 to $200,000. The online auction lasted a week. I checked the bidding obsessively between classes, watching as collectors from London, Tokyo, and New York drove the price up higher and higher. $120,000, $175,000, $220,000. On the final day, I sat in Mike's basement, both of us staring at the screen as the last minutes of the auction ticked down. A bidding war erupted between someone from Japan and a collector in England. $235,000, $242,000, $248,000. And then, with just seconds left, a new bidder jumped in. $250,000. The auction closed. Sold. Mike's scream probably woke up the entire neighborhood. He grabbed me in a bear hug, spinning me around the basement like we just won the Super Bowl. "Dude, do you realize what this means? You're rich. You're actually rich." I couldn't speak. The number on the screen seemed unreal. $250,000 for something that had been sitting in a cardboard box in Grandpa's garage. When I finally found my voice, I said, "I guess Grandpa was right. These aren't just old records, they're history." Mike flopped down on the couch, still grinning like a maniac. "We are officially cooler than all those fitness influencers combined." "Take that, Alex." I laughed, but my mind was elsewhere. I remembered Grandpa saying, "Money isn't everything, but it sure helps you play the records louder." Now I understood what he meant. This wasn't just about the cash. It was about proving that his soul was alive in these discs, that what he valued had real worth. The next morning, I received an email from someone claiming to be a collector from California. The message was brief but intriguing. Congratulations on your Beatles sale. I've been watching with interest. We should meet. Your collection contains something even more significant than you realize. Contact me if you're interested in learning more. I showed the email to Mike, who immediately went into conspiracy mode. It could be a scam. Or maybe it's some eccentric billionaire who wants to buy the whole collection. Or what if it's Paul McCartney himself? I rolled my eyes, but my curiosity was piqued. What else could possibly be hiding in these thousands of records? What other treasures had Grandpa Charlie tucked away? I looked at Mike, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I think this is just the beginning. I replied to the email with trembling fingers. I'm interested. When and where can we meet? Whatever was coming next, Grandpa's records had already changed my life forever. And somehow, I knew the real adventure was just getting started. That mysterious email from the California collector turned out to be both legit and a game changer, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I need to tell you about what happened with that $250,000. Most teenagers who suddenly come into that kind of cash would probably blow it on a fancy car or designer clothes. My parents certainly expected me to crawl back home, begging forgiveness and flashing my new wealth. Alex even texted me after the news broke. Nice lottery win. Want to buy my old room? Mom's turning it into a home gym. I didn't respond. Instead, I made what Dave from Vintage Vinyl called the smartest dumb decision he'd ever seen. I decided to open my own record store. The smart part? Real estate in Portland was in a weird spot. The pandemic had emptied out a bunch of downtown storefronts, and landlords were desperate for tenants. I found this perfect little space in the hip Hawthorne district. Exposed brick walls, big windows, wooden floors with just the right amount of creaking. The rent was actually reasonable, especially with a 2-year lease commitment. The dumb part? Opening a physical retail store selling vinyl records in 2025, when most people consume music through streaming services. Dave laughed for about 5 minutes when I told him my plan. Kid, I love your enthusiasm, but record stores are dinosaurs. I'm only still in business because I own my building and I'm too stubborn to quit. But I had something Dave didn't, a social media strategy, and Grandpa Charlie's collection as inventory. I quit my job at Vintage Vinyl, though Dave and I remain friends, and Mike and I started renovating the space. We named it Vinyl Revival in honor of Grandpa and his love for music. The renovation was educational. YouTube tutorials can only teach you so much about plumbing and electrical work. Mike was supposedly helping with painting, but his help mostly involved accidentally spilling paint on himself and then running around the store yelling, "Look at me! I'm an abstract masterpiece." Put me in MoMA. It took twice as long with him around, but it was 10 times more fun. The California collector, whose name turned out to be Richard, finally met me at the store during renovations. He wasn't some creepy old guy as I'd feared, but a middle-aged professor of music history from Berkeley with an impressive knowledge of rare recordings. He showed me what I'd missed in Grandpa's collection, several test pressings from obscure 60s garage bands that later became hugely influential. Richard offered to help authenticate and value the rarest pieces in exchange for first dibs on certain albums. It was a fair deal that eventually developed into a genuine friendship and mentorship. Opening day was a disaster in the best possible way. I'd been posting teaser videos on TikTok and Instagram for weeks. Stories about specific albums from Grandpa's collection, how he'd picked them up for $1, and now they were worth thousands. I'd show the album playing on a turntable, talk about the history and why it mattered. To my shock, people actually followed along. By opening day, I had about 30,000 followers. Not exactly influencer territory, but enough that when we unlocked the doors at 10 a.m., there was a line down the block. We sold out of everything I'd priced under $50 within 2 hours. The more expensive stuff took longer, but by closing time, we'd made back a month's rent and then some. More importantly, the store buzzed with conversations all day, hipsters, music nerds, and old rockers flipping through vinyl and sharing stories. An older man with a gray ponytail spent an hour telling me about seeing Jimi Hendrix live in '68. A college girl with blue hair discovered Led Zeppelin for the first time and nearly cried when she heard Since I've Been Loving You on our listening station. A middle school kid bought his first turntable and asked me to recommend albums to start his collection. That night, after we locked up, Mike and I sat on the floor of the empty shop, exhausted but riding high. "Dude," he said, passing me a soda, "I think your grandpa would be seriously proud right now." I looked around at the walls we covered with album artwork, the vintage concert posters, the turntables set up for customers to test records before buying. It wasn't just a store. It was everything Grandpa Charlie had taught me about music, turned into a physical space where others could experience it too. "Yeah," I said, "I think he would." The next few months were a blur. The store's success snowballed, partly thanks to our social media presence, which kept growing as I shared more stories about specific records from Grandpa's collection. Every album had a history: where he bought it, who he was dating when he first heard it, what concert reminded him of. I'd made sure to jot down all of Grandpa's stories over the years, and now they were paying off in a way I'd never imagined. People came in specifically asking about that Doors album Charlie got signed at the drugstore, or the Velvet Underground record from your TikTok yesterday. Mike turned out to have a hidden talent for sales. His goofy personality and encyclopedic knowledge of 80s and 90s music made him the perfect floor manager. Customers loved him, especially when he made ridiculous claims with a completely straight face. One day, I overheard him try and sell a soundtrack album. "This is an extremely rare pressing. Bob Marley's greatest hits." The customer flipped it over and stared at him. "Dude, this is literally the Shrek soundtrack." Mike didn't miss a beat. "Exactly. Most people don't know this, but Bob Marley was the original choice to voice Donkey before Eddie Murphy." The customer burst out laughing, but bought the soundtrack anyway. That was Mike's magic, making people feel like they were in on the joke, part of our little vinyl community. Our little team grew. We hired Zoe, a retired jazz singer who knew more about Blue Note recordings than anyone I'd ever met, and Eli, a computer science student who helped us build a proper inventory system and online store. About 6 months in, just as things were really getting established, a man in dark sunglasses and a tailored suit walked in. He browsed silently for about an hour, occasionally taking notes on his phone. Just before closing, he approached the counter where I was working. "I represent a private collector," he said quietly. "My client would like to purchase your entire inventory. $1 million. Cash deal, no questions asked." I nearly fell off my stool. $1 million? For records I'd inherited for free? It was insane. "Take the offer while it's available," he whispered, sliding a business card across the counter. My client isn't known for his patience. I looked around the store. At Zoe helping an elderly couple find some Ella Fitzgerald albums. At Mike enthusiastically explaining the difference between original and remastered Pink Floyd to a teenager. At 2 college students on our listening station, discovering Fleetwood Mac's rumors for the first time. Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. Music isn't about selling. It's about sharing your soul. "I'm sorry," I told the man. "The collection isn't for sale. Not all at once, anyway." He raised an eyebrow above his sunglasses. "You're turning down $1 million? "I'm not selling my grandfather's legacy in bulk," I said. "But your client is welcome to shop here like everyone else. One record at a time." He left without another word, but I noticed him snap a photo of the store before he walked out. That evening, I told Mike about the offer. "You turned down $1 million?" he shrieked, nearly dropping the stack of records he was organizing. "Are you insane?" Maybe I was, but selling everything at once felt wrong. Grandpa hadn't collected these records, so I could flip them to the highest bidder. He'd collected them to preserve something special, something that deserved to be shared, not locked away in some billionaire's private collection. 2 days later, I got an email from Christie's auction house. They'd heard about my collection, I suspected the sunglasses man, and were interested in featuring several of my rarest items in their upcoming Icons of Music auction. Sotheby's reached out the next day with a similar request. This was different from the bulk offer. Auctioning select pieces would put them in the hands of serious collectors who would appreciate them, while allowing me to keep most of the collection available to everyday music lovers at the store. I agreed to both auctions, selecting different pieces for each. The news spread fast. Local papers wanted interviews, then national outlets. Then a producer from a streaming documentary series called about featuring the store in an episode about new vinyl culture. Things were spinning out of control in the best possible way. I kept thinking about how furious my parents must be, seeing their failure son suddenly successful doing exactly what they'd mocked. I hadn't spoken to them since that night I left. Sometimes I wondered if they missed me at all, or if they were just relieved to have one less problem to deal with. Alex had tried reaching out once for money, but I'd ignored him. My phone was blowing up with media requests faster than I could answer them. Mike suggested hiring a PR person, which seemed ridiculously fancy for a teenager who just happened to inherit some records. But maybe he was right. As I sat in the back office after closing, staring at my overflowing email inbox, I realized how far I'd come from that night in my parents' dining room when Alex snapped my Pink Floyd record in half. Now I was preparing to auction rare records at Christie's and Sotheby's. Journalists wanted my story. Customers lined up to visit my store. If this was failure, I was pretty okay with it. I picked up my phone and called Richard, my California collector friend. "I think I'm going to need some help with these auctions," I told him. "Things are about to get serious." Little did I know just how serious they would get, or how quickly my world was about to change again. The Christie's and Sotheby's auctions changed everything. We only put 8 records up for auction, 4 at each house, but that was enough. A rare pressing of the Velvet Underground and Nico, with the unpeeled banana, sold for $78,000. An original mono pressing of Bob Dylan's The Freewheelin' with the 4 pulled tracks went for $112,000. The other 6 included rarities from the Doors, Pink Floyd, and some jazz recordings that collectors went crazy for. By the time the final gavel fell, we'd made just over $500,000, and that was after auction fees, commissions, and taxes. Not bad for 8 records from a collection that my family had called worthless clutter. But it wasn't the money that changed my life. It was the attention. Suddenly, I was a rock star without a guitar. Rolling Stone published a feature about me titled "The Teenager Who Revived Vinyl." The New York Times style section called me Generation Z's unlikely vinyl prophet. NPR invited me onto their music podcast, where the host introduced me as the guardian of lost music. I sat in my little shop after hours, surrounded by records that had belonged to Grandpa Charlie, trying to process it all. I couldn't help thinking, "Grandpa, I hope you be proud of what I'm doing with your legacy." My social media following exploded overnight. Vinyl Revival's TikTok had over 1 million followers. Our Instagram account grew so fast that I had to hire a college student just to help manage the comments and messages. The shop's website crashed 3 times from traffic surges after media appearances. Richard, my California collector friend, suggested expanding beyond just selling records. "You've got a community now," he explained over the phone. "They're not just buying vinyl. They're buying into a culture, a story. Your grandfather's story." That conversation sparked an idea. With Richard's help, I launched vinylstories.com, an online platform where record collectors from around the world could share the stories behind their favorite albums. Not just the value or rarity, but the human stories, where they found them, what memories they held, why they mattered. The site took off immediately. We had submissions from teenagers who just discovered vinyl through our TikTok videos and octogenarians who've been collecting since the 1950s. A woman from Japan shared how she protected her Beatles collection during a flood by holding the records above her head for hours. A man from England described finding a rare David Bowie single that had once belonged to his father, who he'd never met. With the shop running smoothly under Mike and Zoe's management, I had time to dive deeper into Grandpa's collection. There were still hundreds of records I hadn't properly cataloged, mostly obscure stuff that probably wasn't worth much but might have sentimental value. That's when I found it, tucked inside a plain white sleeve with only a date scribbled on it. July 5th, 69. I put on the turntable, not expecting much. Maybe a recording of Grandpa's old garage band or a bootleg of mediocre quality. The first few seconds were just crowd noise and someone tapping a microphone. Then a voice I didn't recognize mumbled something indistinct. And then that sound, that unmistakable, otherworldly sound of Jimi Hendrix's guitar. I froze, staring at the spinning vinyl like it might disappear if I blinked. This wasn't a commercial recording I recognized. The sound was raw, unpolished, but undeniably live. Hendrix was playing something improvised, something I'd never heard on any album or bootleg compilation. My hand shook as I carefully lifted the needle and checked the record again for any identifying marks. Nothing but that date. I called Richard immediately, describing what I'd heard. July 5th, 1969, he asked, his voice suddenly tense with excitement. Jason, that could be from a Seattle show, an unheard recording. There are no known tapes from that performance. If it's authentic, he didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what this could mean. I spent the next week authenticating the recording with Richard's help. We consulted Hendrix experts, audio engineers, and music historians. They all reached the same conclusion. This was an unknown, amateur recording of Jimi Hendrix performing in his hometown of Seattle, just 14 months before his death. The sound quality wasn't perfect. It had obviously been recorded by someone in the audience using basic equipment, but it was clear enough to hear Hendrix playing extended versions of songs that had never been released, along with personal stories about growing up in Seattle between tracks. It was like discovering a lost chapter of music history. The news leaked faster than we could control it. Guitar magazines wanted exclusives. Streaming services offered six-figure deals for digital rights. Record labels proposed special edition releases. My phone buzzed constantly with text messages and calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Our shop's email inbox overflowed with interview requests and partnership offers. Someone even slid a handwritten acquisition offer under the store's door after hours. 7 figures, no questions asked. Vinyl Revival had a higher security to manage the crowd of Hendrix fans and curious onlookers who suddenly appeared, hoping to hear even a snippet of the recording. In the middle of this chaos, I received a text from a number I hadn't seen in months. Alex. Hey bro, saw you on TV. Pretty cool what you're doing with Grandpa's junk. Maybe you could share some of that cash with family? After all, we're blood. I stare at my phone, a strange mix of anger and pity washing over me. Alex had broken Grandpa's Pink Floyd record right in front of me. He called the collection junk and trash. Now, he wanted a cut of what it had become. I deleted the message without responding and blocked the number. The next day, my parents showed up at the store. I was in the back office when Mike burst in, eyes wide. Dude, your folks are here. Like, right now in the shop. What do you want me to do? For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 8 months had passed since that night I'd left with my boxes of clutter. 8 months of building something they'd said was impossible. 8 months of proving them wrong. I stood up, straightened my Hendrix t-shirt, felt appropriate, and walked out to face them. Mom looked exactly the same, maybe with a new haircut. Dad seemed thinner, more tired. They stood awkwardly by the front counter, looking out of place among the young hipsters and music enthusiasts browsing the racks. When Mom saw me, her eyes filled with tears. Dad tried to maintain his usual stern expression, but I could see it cracking around the edges. I didn't yell. I didn't throw them out. I just asked, "What are you doing here?" What followed was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. They admitted they'd been wrong about Grandpa's collection. That was obvious now. Mom said she missed me. Dad, in his roundabout way, suggested I'd shown unexpected business acumen. When they asked if I considered coming home, I surprised myself by laughing out loud. This is my home now. I told them, gesturing around the shop. Grandpa's records aren't just things to me. They're his voice, his memories, his life. You never understood that. They left with an awkward hug from Mom and a stiff handshake from Dad. I didn't hate them anymore, but I also knew I couldn't go back to being the person I was before. Too much had changed. As spring turned to summer, I remembered something Grandpa used to say. Life is like a Hendrix solo. Play it loud enough that everyone hears you, but make sure the melody is yours. I was definitely playing loud now, and the melody, it was starting to feel like my own. With Richard's guidance, I decided to auction the Hendrix recording through a specialized music memorabilia auction house in New York. We would create a limited edition vinyl pressing of the recording, with all proceeds going to a music education foundation for underprivileged kids in Seattle, Hendrix's hometown. The auction would be a major event, covered by music journalists from around the world. Richard suggested I should be there in person, to tell the story of how my grandfather preserved this piece of music history, without even realizing its significance. The night before my flight to New York, I sat alone in the shop after closing. I put on Grandpa's favorite album, Abbey Road, and just listened, really listened, the way he'd taught me to. I thought about how much had changed in less than a year, from a kid who didn't fit into the owner of a successful business, from someone whose passion was mocked to someone whose opinion was sought after by Rolling Stone, from sleeping on an air mattress in Mike's basement to preparing for a high-profile auction in New York. Mike interrupted my reflection, barging in with his usual lack of subtlety. Earth to Jason, are you seriously sitting in the dark listening to sad music tonight before your big New York adventure? That's way too indie movie protagonist, even for you. He flicked on the lights and tossed a gift-wrap package at me. Inside was a vintage leather messenger bag, perfect for carrying records. From me and Zoe, he explained, for your fancy New York business meetings. Can't have you showing up with your ratty backpack, like some college dropout. I packed that night with a weird mix of excitement and nervousness. The Hendrix record was securely stored in a specialized case designed for transporting valuable vinyl. My one decent outfit was carefully folded to minimize wrinkles. Mike's gift messenger bag held my laptop and the authentication documents. As I zipped up my suitcase, my phone pinged with an email from the auction house. Subject line, urgent, change of plans. According to the message, due to unprecedented interest, they were moving the auction to a larger venue and adding a press conference the day before. They arranged for a car to pick me up at the airport. The email ended with a sentence that made me sit down hard on my bed. We've been contacted by representatives from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame regarding potential acquisition and permanent exhibition of the recording. This was getting bigger than I'd ever imagined. What had started with Grandpa Charlie's cluttered collection was now potentially headed for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I finished packing in a daze, double and triple checking that the Hendrix record was secure. Tomorrow I'd be flying to New York, carrying a piece of music history in my hands. Little did I know that New York held more surprises than I could possibly imagine, and that the greatest discovery from Grandpa's collection was still waiting to be found. New York City hummed like an old tube amplifier with too much gain. From the moment I stepped off the plane, everything vibrated with possibility. The auction house had sent a sleek black car with tinted windows to pick me up, a far cry from Mike's rust bucket van or the city bus I usually took to work. My hotel room overlooked Central Park, another surreal detail in what felt like someone else's life. I stood at the window that first night, the Hendrix record locked in the room safe, watching the city lights flicker like stars that had fallen to earth. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered to the empty room. "Grandpa, are you seeing this?" The pre-auction press conference the next morning was intimidating. Cameras flashed as I walked into a room filled with music journalists, record executives, and collectors. My vintage Zeppelin t-shirt and jeans stood out among the suits and designer outfits, but I figured authenticity was my brand now. The auction house representative introduced me as the young man who has revolutionized vinyl collecting for a new generation. People applauded. It was surreal. I told Grandpa Charlie's story, how he collected records his entire life, how he'd taught me to appreciate them, how he'd left them to me when everyone else thought they were worthless. I explained finding the Hendrix recording and what it meant to music history. A reporter asked what I planned to do with the money from the auction. Half goes to music education programs in Seattle. I explained. The other half will fund scholarships for kids who want to study music preservation and history. My grandfather believed music belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford to buy it. More applause, more camera flashes. That evening, I got a surprising call from Richard, my California collector friend. "There's someone you need to meet," he said, sounding unusually excited. "A colleague of mine. He worked with Hendrix's sound engineer in the late 60s. He's in New York and wants to talk to you about the recording. An hour later, I was sitting in a quiet hotel bar with Richard and an elderly gentleman named Martin who walked with cane and had hands gnarled by arthritis. Despite his physical limitations, his eyes were sharp and alert. Martin examined the record with those arthritic hands, handling it with the reverence of a priest with a sacred relic. "I was there that night," he said softly. "Seattle, July 5th, 1969. I wasn't officially on the crew, just a local kid who helped with equipment in exchange for getting into shows." Jimi was different that night. Playing in his hometown made him nostalgic. He told stories between songs that I'd never heard him share before. Martin looked up at me. I recorded the show on my portable reel-to-reel. It wasn't great quality, but I captured everything. After, I made a vinyl transfer for myself, just one copy. Years later, I sold it to a collector at a music convention in Portland. My heart was racing. "Do you remember who?" Martin smiled. "An enthusiastic guy named Charlie. He couldn't afford what I was asking, but he was so passionate about music history that I sold it to him anyway. He promised to preserve it. Charlie, my grandfather." The pieces clicked into place. "He kept that promise," I said quietly. "He kept all of it safe, and now the world gets to hear it." Martin's eyes glistened. "That's all any of us wanted, for the music to survive." The next morning was the auction. I sat backstage, cradling a coffee I was too nervous to drink, listening to the auctioneer's rhythmic patter as other lots were sold. The Hendrix recording was the final item, the crown jewel of the event. When it was time, I moved to the side of the stage where I could watch without being seen. The auctioneer announced the item with appropriate reverence, explaining its provenance and significance. A screen displayed images of the record and information about Hendrix's Seattle performance. The bidding started at $500,000. It was like watching a tennis match where every volley was worth thousands of dollars. Representatives from major museums and private collectors signaled their bids with subtle gestures. Phone and online bidders joined the fray through auction house staff. $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. The room buzzed with excitement as the price climbed higher. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about owning a piece of American music history, a moment that had been lost and was now found. For $1 million, $4.5 million, $4.8 million. I could hardly breathe. The numbers had lost all meaning, becoming abstract symbols rather than actual currency. This was more money than I could comprehend. Finally, after a tense volley between a phone bidder and someone in the back of the room, the auctioneer's gavel fell. Sold for $5.2 million to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The room erupted in applause. I stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Backstage, the auction house executives congratulated me, explaining that after their commission and the promised donations to music education, I would receive just over $2 million. They handed me a glass of sparkling cider for the toast, recognizing I wasn't old enough for the champagne everyone else was drinking. To preserving music history, someone toasted. To Grandpa Charlie, I whispered, taking a small sip. As the celebration continued around me, I slipped away to a quiet corner, needing a moment alone to process everything. That's when I saw them. My parents and Alex were standing awkwardly by the exit, dressed more formally than I'd ever seen them. Mom spotted me first, nudging Dad and pointing in my direction. Alex, wearing a suit that looked like he'd borrowed it from someone larger, gave me an uncomfortable wave. My stomach dropped. How had they found me? Why were they here? The last time I'd seen them was their brief visit to the shop months ago, which had ended with an awkward half-reconciliation. I considered ducking out another door, but it was too late. They were walking toward me. "Jason," Mom said, her voice tight with forced enthusiasm. "We saw you on the news. The auction, it's amazing." Dad cleared his throat. "Your grandfather will be very proud. We misjudged the situation." Alex, never one for subtlety, cut straight to the point. "Dude, you're loaded now. $5 million. That's insane." I looked at them, these familiar strangers who share my DNA, but not my passion. It's not $5 million. Half goes to charity, and there are taxes and fees. But yes, it's a lot of money. Alex's eyes gleamed. So, about that, we're family, Jason. Family sticks together, right? Maybe you could, share some of the wealth? After all, Grandpa was our grandfather, too. And there it was, the real reason for their appearance. Not pride or reconciliation, but a cash grab. I felt a strange calm settling over me, like the moment when a record ends, but before the needle lifts, that perfect silence of completion. You broke my records and my dreams, I said quietly. You called Grandpa's collection junk and told me to throw it away. This isn't about money. It's about how you threw me away along with Grandpa's soul. Mom tried to interrupt, her face flushing with shame or anger or both. Jason, that's not fair. No, what wasn't fair was making a 17-year-old kid choose between his family and his passion. What wasn't fair was breaking something precious to me just to make a point. I took a deep breath, surprised by how steady my voice remained. I don't hate you. I'm not even angry anymore. But I don't owe you anything. Not financially, not emotionally. I turned and walked away, ignoring Alex's protests and Mom's tearful calls. It didn't feel like revenge or justice, just a needle finally lifting at the end of a song that had played too long. Outside the auction house, I found a bench in a small park and sat down, letting the spring air clear my head. My phone buzzed with a text from Mike. So, are you officially a gazillionaire yet? And more importantly, did you keep the receipt? Because I need to return that messenger bag and get you a platinum one. I laughed out loud, grateful for his ability to cut through the drama with humor. I texted back, need a business partner for world vinyl domination? His response was immediate. Only if I get a company jet and an official title. Chief Awesome Officer sounds about right. Back in Portland the following week, life simultaneously changed completely and not at all. The money sat in newly established investment accounts, gathering interest while I consulted with financial advisors. The shop continued to thrive, though now we had a waiting list of collectors hoping to purchase pieces from the Charlie Collection, as it had become known. Vinyl Revival expanded, renting the space next door to create a small performance venue for local musicians. We launched a nonprofit arm that provided instruments and music education to schools with underfunded arts programs. And Mike, he became the official director of Vibe and Vintage Acquisition, with a salary that finally allowed him to fix his perpetually dying van. Christmas came, the first one since Grandpa Charlie had passed. I closed the shop early and invited the whole staff, now 12 people, to a holiday dinner at a restaurant downtown. As everyone chatted and laughed around the table, I realized I created something more valuable than a successful business. I built a family of choice, united by our love of music. After dinner, I handed out bonus checks and gifts. For Mike, I found a rare Japanese pressing of his favorite album, Rap with a Bow. Dude, he whispered when he opened it, this is worth thousands. So is your friendship, I replied, immediately embarrassed by how corny it sounded. In February, I received a letter from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, inviting me to the official unveiling of the Hendrix Seattle recording exhibit. They created an interactive display where visitors could learn about the concert, see the record, and hear selected tracks through headphones. They'd named it the Charlie Matthews Memorial Collection, honoring Grandpa as a preserver of this lost piece of music history. The letter included a photo of the exhibit, with Grandpa's name prominently displayed on a plaque. I booked flights for myself, Mike, and Dave from Vintage Vinyl, the man who'd first helped me authenticate Beatles' signatures and who had become something of a father figure over the past year. Standing in that museum, seeing Grandpa's name immortalized alongside rock legends, I felt a circle completing. The record he'd bought from a sound technician named Martin decades ago had found its way home, preserved, celebrated, shared with the world. As visitors moved through the exhibit, putting on headphones and discovering Hendrix's lost performance, I watched their faces light up with the same joy I felt the first time Grandpa played Abbey Road for me in his garage. Mike nudged my arm. Your grandpa's basically a rock star now. He always was. I replied, I just didn't realize how much. By summer, Vinyl Revival had opened 2 more locations, one in Seattle and another in San Francisco. Each store maintained the same philosophy. Music wasn't just something to consume, but something to experience and share. We hired knowledgeable staff who were passionate about helping customers discover new sounds and rediscover old favorites. I found myself traveling between the 3 stores, overseeing operations but still making time to work the floor, to talk with customers and share stories about specific albums. No matter how successful the business became, I never wanted to lose that connection to what made it special in the first place. On what would have been Grandpa Charlie's 78th birthday, I sat alone in the original Portland store after closing. I pulled out the last record he'd ever given me, a copy of Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti that he presented on my 16th birthday with a declaration that it contained the greatest guitar work ever recorded. I placed it carefully on the turntable and dropped the needle on 10 Years Gone. As Jimmy Page's guitar filled the room, I remembered something Grandpa had told me while we listened to the same track years earlier. Life is like a record collection, Jason. Some days are scratchy, some are warped, and some play perfectly. But every album tells a story, and together, they become the soundtrack of your life. Looking around at the store I'd built, the vintage concert posters on the walls, the carefully organized vinyl and custom shelving, the listening stations where people discovered new musical loves every day, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This wasn't just a business. It was Grandpa's legacy transformed into something new, but still rooted in his passion. I'd become a millionaire before my 20th birthday, but that wasn't the real success story. The true victory was in preserving something precious that might otherwise have been lost, not just the rare records or the Hendrix recording, but the human connection to music that Grandpa had valued above all else. Americans have always been nostalgic for the tangible in an increasingly digital world. There's something profoundly satisfying about the ritual of vinyl, selecting an album, carefully removing it from its sleeve, placing it on a turntable, and dropping the needle. It demands presence in a way that streaming never will. Grandpa understood this long before vinyl's resurgence. Digital is convenient, he'd say, but vinyl is an experience. It's the difference between looking at a photo of the Grand Canyon and standing at its edge. In rescuing his collection, I hadn't just preserved plastic discs, I'd kept alive a way of experiencing music that was in danger of disappearing. 5 years have passed since that night when Alex broke my Pink Floyd record at the dinner table. I'm 22 now, running a successful business that expanded to 7 stores across the country. Rolling Stone named me one of the 25 people shaping the future of music, which still makes me laugh when I think about it. My relationship with my family remains complicated. We see each other occasionally at holidays, maintaining a civil distance. Alex eventually apologized, genuinely it seemed, after he matured a bit and started his own business, a gym, unsurprisingly. My parents adapted to reality that I wasn't coming back to their vision of normal life, though they still sometimes ask when I'm going to college. The Charlie Matthews Foundation, which I established with proceeds from the Hendrix auction, has funded music education programs in over 50 schools nationwide. We provided grants to archivists preserving deteriorating recordings and supported young artists creating new music inspired by the classics. As for me personally, I still live in a modest apartment above the original Vinyl Revival store. I still wear band t-shirts every day. I still spend hours listening to records, discovering new details in familiar songs. But now when teenagers come into the store, looking slightly lost and deeply passionate about music that their friends don't understand, I recognize myself in them. I take them to the listening stations, put on something from Grandpa's collection, and watch their faces as they experience vinyl for the first time. Today, a shy kid in a Worn Doors t-shirt came in, clutching his allowance money and looking overwhelmed by the selection. I showed him to our Essential First Album section, curated specifically for new collectors, and pulled out Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix. This changed everything, I told him, setting it up on the turntable. Just listen. As the opening notes of Purple Haze filled the room, his eyes widened with that unmistakable look of musical revelation. At that moment, I knew Grandpa Charlie was there with us, nodding in approval. Music isn't just sound, he always said. It's a conversation across time, connecting us to everyone who ever felt something while listening to the same song. That conversation continues. The needle drops, the vinyl spins, and somewhere, Grandpa Charlie is still listening with me.